Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're asking a question I'm sure many of you have pondered. Is the Panasonic Lumix G7, still worth it in 2025? It was a smash hit back in 2015. But how does it compare with all the new tech out there these days? Well, to help us figure that out, we're diving into a hands-on review by Leo from LensClear, who's been using the G7 for years. So let's see what he has to say and figure out if this camera, still has some life left in it for today's creators.
It's really interesting because back in 2015, the G7 was like this pioneer,
Hmm.
making 4K recording something that, well, more creators could actually use. Nowadays, yeah, I mean, you can shoot 4K on pretty much any phone, but back then, the G7 was a total game changer.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I remember back then, just drooling over 4K footage. It's kind of wild how quickly technology, changes. But actually, that kind of brings up a good point. The G7 is still selling like hotcakes on the used market. And Leo's review really shows it's not just nostalgia driving those sales.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just looking at the specs, too. One thing Leo really emphasizes is how the G7 feels in your hand. Got a solid grip, that articulated touchscreen, which is like a lifesaver for those tricky angles. And then you've got direct access dials, so you're not always like, menu diving all the time.
Ah, man, I'm a total sucker for good ergonomics and direct access styles. Sign me up. It just makes shooting so much smoother. And here's something I didn't expect. So the body is plastic, but Leo says it's surprisingly tough. Not what you'd think, huh?
Yeah, it just goes to show that, durability can come in different forms. But okay, let's get into how it actually performs. How's that autofocus system holding up in 2025?
Well, Leo says it's decent, but not, its strongest feature. He did find a workaround, though. Or for video, especially if you're using those older manual lenses, he recommends using single area focus.
Hmm, that's a pretty good tip. It kind of forces you to, like, be more intentional about your focus,
Wow.
especially
Yeah.
when you're using vintage glass. Speaking of video, I'm curious, is the 4K on the G7 still a viable option these days?
Leo makes a really good case for it, actually. He says that 4K 30p is still kind of like the sweet spot for lots of creators. I mean, most screens can display it, and it's not as demanding on your computer when you're editing. Plus, the G7 has this Cine-like D profile, so basically what that means is you've got more flexibility for color grading and, tweaking the look of your footage after you've shot it. Kind of like those fancy Allage profiles you see on those, higher-end cameras these days.
Oh, wow. That's a huge plus for anyone who's getting serious about filmmaking, especially if they're on a tight budget. Gives you way more control over the final product. But I'm spotting a potential problem here. The audio. No headphone jack in 2025. Seems like a pretty big oversight, don't you think?
You'd think so, right? But actually, Leo kind of sees it as a blessing in disguise. He uses external mics that have headphone jacks, or he just monitors the audio straight from the mic itself. So it actually forced him to learn, good audio recording techniques.
Huh. Yeah. That's the kind of limitation that can actually make you a better creator in the long run,
Yeah.
Forces you to think outside the box. And, it's funny, that kind of ties into one of the G7's biggest strengths, the lens ecosystem.
Okay, get ready for this. We're talking micro four thirds, and let me tell you, you've got it all. Wide angle, primes, zooms, macro, even fisheye lenses. Man, it can be overwhelming. I remember just getting lost in all the choices when I started out. But since it's a smaller sensor format, those lenses tend to be, well, more compact and easier on the wallet, too.
Totally. And Leo actually shouts out a few of his favorites. For stills, he loves the Panasonic 20mm f1.7 and the Olympus 17mm f1.8. They're both known for tack-sharp images and that creamy background blur.
And for video, his go-to is the Olympus 1240mm f2.8 Pro. It's a super versatile zoom that covers a lot of situations. But here's where things get really interesting. You can actually use those older vintage lenses on the G7 with an adapter.
Oh, wow. Talk about a creative playground. Leo's
Oh.
always messing around with old Canon, Minolta, even some Russian lenses, believe it or not. It might seem like a step backward going manual focus, but honestly, it teaches you so much about controlling, your image.
It's that hands-on approach that I think a lot of, photographers are kind of craving these days. It's about taking control and really understanding the fundamentals of photography. Speaking of which, let's not forget about the G7's still photography chops. It's got a 16-megapixel sensor, which might not sound like much by today's standards, but it's more than enough to make incredible prints.
Yeah, and remember, this was cutting edge back in 2015. Plus, if you use good lenses and good technique, you can still capture amazing photos, even blow them up to poster size. Leo says it has great dynamic range too. So basically that means it can capture more detail in the highlights and shadows in a scene, so you've got more to work with when you're editing those photos, especially if you shoot raw.
That reminds me of something Leo said about the G7 being a fantastic learning tool.
Hmm.
In a world that's, obsessed with computational photography, it really takes you back to the
It's
basics.
like a photography boot camp.
Yeah.
It forces you to learn, exposure, composition, focus. You can't just rely on the camera to do all the thinking for you.
It's all about building that strong foundation, right? Which is so crucial even if you, eventually move on to more advanced cameras. So who exactly would benefit from a G7 in 2025? I mean, is it really worth it?
Well, I think Leo makes a good argument for a few different types of people. Let's dive into that after a quick break. So, yeah, we were talking about who might benefit from a G7 in 2025. It's so easy to, get caught up in always wanting the newest, fanciest gear. But Leo makes a good point about this older camera actually being a great fit for some folks.
Yeah, totally. He specifically mentions budget filmmakers. You get, solid 4K video without having to spend a fortune. I mean, if you're just starting out, it's tempting to like drop a ton of money on a new camera, but the G7 proves you don't have to do that.
Yeah, for sure. It's a solid entry point. And that Cinelike D profile, that gives you, room to grow your skills in post, which is great. And, new photographers, they would also find a lot to like about this camera. The G7's like pretty user-friendly, takes great pics, and it has that awesome micro four thirds lens ecosystem we were talking about.
Oh, yeah, and those lenses are so compact. It makes the G7 a fantastic travel camera, too. Leo even mentions its durability, which is a huge plus if you're, taking it on adventures. I know I'd be less worried about, like, bumping it around compared to some of those other more delicate cameras
Yeah.
out there.
And plus, you can use the money you save on the camera
Yeah.
to invest in some really nice lenses. Speaking of lenses, let's talk about that lens ecosystem a bit more. It's one of the things that makes the G7 still relevant in 2025.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember when I first got into photography, I was just like totally overwhelmed by all the lens options. But with the G7 and that, micro four thirds system, you've got a crazy amount of lenses to choose from. Wide angles for landscapes, primes for portraits, macro for those close-ups. I mean, you name it, they've got it.
And what's really cool is they tend to be more compact and affordable than lenses for those bigger sensor cameras. That makes them perfect for traveling or, just everyday shooting where you don't want to be lugging around, a ton of gear.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance between quality, portability, and price. And I think, the G7 nails it. But it's not just about, the modern lenses. The fact that you can adapt vintage lenses to the G7, that just opens up a whole world of creative possibilities.
Oh man, it's like you're stepping back in time. You get to experience photography through literally a different lens. Leo talks about experimenting with those old Canon lenses, Minolta, even some obscure Russian lenses, if you can believe it. And yeah, it might seem a little weird to use manual focus these days, but it teaches you a lot about how to control the image.
It's that hands-on approach that I think a lot of photographers are really craving these days. It's about, taking control and really understanding those fundamentals of photography. Speaking of fundamentals, let's go back to the G7's video features for a sec. Leo makes a pretty strong argument for 4K 30p still being relevant in 2025. But what about some of those other, video features?
Well, one thing that really stands out is the G7's Cinelike D profile. We talked about this a little earlier, but I think it's worth emphasizing how useful this is, especially for those budget-conscious filmmakers. Basically, Cinelike D gives you more flexibility when you're editing footage. You can adjust the colors and contrast more easily to create a specific look or style.
It's like having a mini film studio right there in your camera, and it really opens up those creative possibilities, especially, if you're just starting out and maybe don't have the budget for like those expensive color grading programs. But what about the whole, the audio situation? No headphone jack seems kind of like a deal breaker for serious video work.
Yeah, I can definitely see why that would be a concern. But Leo actually has some practical solutions for that. He uses external mics that have their own headphone jack, or he just monitors the audio straight from the microphone. It seemed like a pain, but he actually argues that it forces you to be more aware of your sound recording techniques, which is a good thing.
Yeah, it's that whole idea of constraints, actually breeding creativity. Sometimes those limitations can actually push you to find those innovative solutions and maybe even develop some better habits in the process. But I'm curious to know more about, your take on the G7 as a learning tool.
I think that's one of its greatest strengths, to be
Oh,
honest.
good.
Especially now when cameras are getting so automated, the G7 strips away all those bells and whistles and forces you to really engage with those fundamentals of photography.
It's like learning to drive a stick shift, before you learn to drive an automatic. You really have to understand how it all works, right?
Right.
And I think that's such a valuable experience, even if you eventually upgrade to a more advanced camera later on.
Absolutely. Mastering the fundamentals gives you a solid foundation to build upon. It's about understanding exposure, composition, focusing instead of just relying on the camera to do all the heavy lifting for you. And that knowledge, that's transferable, no matter what camera you end up using.
Yeah, it's about becoming a more, conscious and deliberate photographer, and that's something that Leo emphasizes throughout his review. He really sees the G7 as a tool that encourages you to slow down, be more thoughtful about your choices, and really connect with that creative process.
It'll be refreshing,
Yeah.
especially in a world that's, all about speed and instant results. And it makes me think about like technology and creativity more broadly. We're constantly bombarded with all these new gadgets and software, but sometimes it's the simplest tools that are actually the most effective.
It's all about finding the tools that inspire you, that fit your workflow, and that help you tell your stories. And sometimes those tools aren't the newest or the fanciest. They're the ones that have, did the test of time, the ones that have proven themselves over the years.
Exactly. And I think, the G7 definitely falls into that category. It's a camera that's, it's aged gracefully and it still offers a lot of value to creators who are looking for, a reliable, affordable, and inspiring tool. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the G7's longevity? Do you think it has a place in the future of photography?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that a lot of photographers are probably asking themselves right now. As technology keeps evolving at this crazy pace, it can be hard to know which tools are uh, gonna last, right? But I think the G7 has a few things going for it.
Like what? I'm really interested to hear your perspective.
Well, for starters, it's just, it's built like a tank. Leo's been using his G7 for years and it's still going strong. That says a lot about the build quality. And then it's also incredibly versatile. You can use it for stills, video, macro, vintage lenses. I mean, the possibilities are kind of endless.
Yeah, those are definitely big selling points, and I think its affordability is another factor. The G7 is a camera that a lot of creators can actually afford, which means it has the potential to inspire a whole new generation of photographers and filmmakers.
Totally agree. And honestly, I think its simplicity is another plus. In a world where cameras are becoming more and more complex, the G7's straightforward design and those intuitive controls, it's almost like a breath of fresh air.
It's a camera that encourages you to focus on the art of photography
Yeah.
rather than getting bogged down in menus and settings. And I
Mm.
think that's a valuable lesson
Hmm.
for any photographer, no matter their skill level.
It's about, cutting out the distractions and getting back to the essence of capturing light and telling stories. And that's something that the G7 does incredibly well.
Well said.
Yeah.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. But what stands out to you the most about the G7? What resonates with you personally?
For me, it's that combination of affordability, versatility, and that hands-on, back to basics approach. It's a camera that really encourages you to experiment, to learn, and to push your creative boundaries. And I think that's especially valuable for photographers who are just starting their journey.
I love that perspective. It's about embracing the journey,
Yeah.
the learning process, the joy of discovery. And I think the G7 is, a great tool for that kind of exploration.
Absolutely. It's a camera that reminds us that creativity isn't about having the most expensive gear or the latest technology. It's about having a vision, a passion for storytelling and a willingness to experiment. And sometimes, those simpler tools are the ones that inspire us the most.
That's a great point. And it makes me think about all those other creative tools out there that might be, overlooked. What are some of the tools that have surprised you or inspired you in your creative journey?
Ooh, that's a tough one. There are so many. But I think one that really stands out for me is my old film camera. It's this clunky manual beast, but there's something kind of magical about shooting film, The slowness, the anticipation, the physical nature of the medium. It's just a totally different experience from shooting digital.
I can totally relate to that. There's a certain romance to film photography that's hard to, uh, you know, replicate with digital. It's like you're stepping back in time and experiencing the craft in its purest form. But it's not just about nostalgia. I think film photography can teach you a lot about patience, precision, and the importance of each shot.
Oh, absolutely. It forces you to slow down, to really think about your composition, your exposure. You have to appreciate the value of each frame. And I think those are lessons that you can apply to any kind of photography, whether you're shooting film or digital.
It's about being present in the moment, observing your surroundings and making those conscious choices about what you want to capture.
Yeah.
And sometimes those limitations can actually, spark your creativity.
It's like that saying, necessity is the mother of invention, right? When you have those limited resources or constraints, you're forced to, think outside the box, come up with creative solutions.
And that's where the magic happens. It's those moments of experimentation and discovery that, we find our most, innovative and expressive work.
It's about embracing the unexpected, the imperfections, the beauty of, the whole creative process. And, it brings us back to the G7 and its ability to inspire that kind of exploration. It might not be the most flashy camera out there, but it's a tool that really encourages you to play, to experiment, and to discover your own unique style.
It's a camera that reminds us that creativity isn't about having the most expensive gear or the latest technology. It's about having a vision, a passion for storytelling and a willingness to push your boundaries. And sometimes those simpler tools are the ones that inspire us the most.
It really is amazing how something like an old, almost forgotten gadget can rekindle that creative spark, Makes you wonder what other treasures are hiding in our closets, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a good reminder to go back and look at our creative tools every once in a while. You never know what you might rediscover. Like you were saying, it's not always about, chasing the latest and greatest. Sometimes those older tools have a certain something that you just can't find anywhere else.
Speaking of that special something. You mentioned film photography earlier. I remember messing around with my dad's old film camera when I was a kid. It was like this whole ritual, loading the film, carefully setting up each shot, and then the anticipation of waiting for the pictures to get developed. It was so different from, the instant gratification of digital.
It's definitely a much slower, more deliberate process, isn't it?
Right.
And I think that, that slowness can actually be a really good thing, especially these days when everything's moving so fast. It forces you to pause, to really look at what's around you and, really connect with the act of creating.
And it's not just, about the nostalgia either. Film photography has had this huge comeback in the past few years. And I think there are a few reasons for that. First, there's this, certain look that film has that's really tough to copy with digital. The grain, the colors, even the imperfections, it all adds up to this, unique look.
And we can't forget about that, the tactile experience of using a film camera, the weight of it in your hand, that satisfying click of the shutter, the feeling of, winding the film advance. It's just, it's a whole sensory experience that you don't get with, digital cameras.
It's almost like, a form of meditation.
Yeah.
You're so focused on the process, the mechanics of the camera, that everything else just kind of disappears.
And I think that's something that we're missing with a lot of modern technology. We're so used to getting instant results, having everything right there, that we've kind of lost touch with the joy of the process, the satisfaction of actually, making something with our own hands.
It's about slowing down, taking the time to appreciate, the journey and finding beauty in those, imperfections. And I think, the G7 in its own way kind of embodies that philosophy. It may not have all the, fancy features of those new cameras, but it encourages you to experiment, to learn, and to, find your own creative voice.
It's a camera that tells us that the best tool is often the one that, really speaks to you, the one that fits how you work and helps you and tell your stories. And sometimes that tool isn't, the newest or the fanciest or the most expensive one. It's the one that just, feels right in your hands, the one that speaks to your creative spirit.
That's beautifully said. I think that's a perfect way to wrap things up. The G7, even though it's a bit older, it's a camera that keeps inspiring, keeps challenging us, and reminds us of the power of creativity.
It's a real testament to the idea that good design, well thought out features, and a focus on those fundamentals can really stand the test of time.
And that sometimes the most meaningful tools are the ones that have been with us, on our journey. The ones that have seen us grow and, evolve as creators.
So as you go out there with your cameras, your paintbrushes, your instruments, or whatever it is you use to, express your creativity, remember to enjoy the process, to appreciate those imperfections, and to hold on to those trusted companions that have helped you along the way.
And who knows, maybe you'll, find a new use for an old favorite, or you'll stumble upon something that sparks a whole new creative adventure. Until next time, keep diving deep.